Okay, welcome everybody. My name's Bob Russin. I'm the chapter president of Northwest Chapter. If we haven't met, and a lot of you we've met only briefly or whatever, I welcome everyone to our chapter event here. We're very fortunate to have Mark and John and Rob and Bart with us today to have a wide-ranging discussion of lots of issues in baseball. I want to just take a second to apologize to everyone for the follow-up, the meeting thing 2 weeks ago. That was my fault, and it was a couple thinking errors on my part, and I apologize. So what I'd like to do is just turn this, unless there's other announcements or something like that that anyone feels the need to make right away here. I'll ask everyone to mute their audio part, and Bart will lead this discussion and introduce the participants. And if you do have questions or comments, put them in the chat room, and Bart and I will communicate that way to avoid having cacophony here as you go along. Okay. All right. So Bart, I'm going to turn it over to you then.
Okay, terrific. Let's see, John and Rob, I'm going to get you to unmute because I'm showing you both as muted. So let's get you, you guys.
I've got my finger on the mute button because my kids are around. So avoiding that sort of stray background noise. I think if it's all right with you, I will just be ready with the unmute button whenever I'm chipping in.
Perfect. That's perfect. Okay. Thanks. This is wonderful to have such a great crowd. For this. Our intent was to make this a pretty open conversation, just an extension of the Hot Stove League we all participate in with friends over the winter. And now we're even on the first day of spring training, so it's even better. Let me really quickly introduce our panelists today. Mark Armour is known to most of you. He's a past chapter president of our chapter, and he's the current national SABR president. Mark's background is a computer software engineer, but he's written books, co-written other books, written many articles on baseball. He's a noted baseball historian and researcher, a past winner of the Chadwick Award from SABR, recognizing his long history of wonderful baseball research, and is really the founder of the Bio Project for SABR, the Baseball Card Committee, lots of baseball activities. So we're really happy to have Mark participating. John Choiniere is with us, and John is got a background in chemistry. He has a PhD in chemistry and was a research scientist at the University of Washington before he succumbed to the siren song of baseball. Gave up that career to go work in baseball with Baseball Prospectus for a while, then the Seattle Mariners. And is currently the manager of analytics for the Mariners, and so John's going to give us a great perspective on some of the rules we talk about and how they affect things on the field.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
And we have Rob Neyer, who is also well known to our chapter. Rob is a well-known baseball writer, both in popular media, the author of, I believe, 6 books on baseball, which have both a historic and often a statistical bent to them. Rob has worked for as diverse organizations as Bill James, ESPN, Fox Sports. Has been the senior editor of, as well as being a writer. And most interestingly to me, is the current commissioner of the West Coast Baseball League. Which I think many of you know is kind of one of the premier in the country amateur baseball leagues, place for some of the high-end college players to play in the summertime. And for Mariner fans, we're well aware that both Marco Gonzalez and Mitch Haniger came out of that league at one point in their early careers. So we're really happy to have Rob.
And James Paxton.
All right. Well, okay, even more. So it's going to be an interesting panel. The idea for this, let me kind of throw the first pitch out here. The idea for this really came out of Zoom calls that I have with a lot of baseball friends, and I'm sure a lot of you are like me. Through the pandemic, as we found ourselves cloistered and not able to be out with friends as often, we started doing these Zoom things. And inevitably, we end up talking baseball. And we're all talking about the changes in the game. We're talking about the current game as the kind of weird abbreviated 2020 season kicked off last year. We talk about some of the rule changes, some of the adaptations that baseball has had to make. And then as we watched that season progress, we talked about how different the play of the game seemed to be. And how, you know, there were more strikeouts, more home runs. Everything just seemed to be different than the game that many of us grew up with. And it just became an open conversation. And I thought we'd kind of continue that. This all came to the fore for me watching the World Series last fall. And I'm gonna pick on them unfairly. It's really not fair because it's just prototypical. But there was one at bat I believe in the 6th game of the World Series where Willie Adames comes up. And there's runners on 1st and 3rd, and Willie Adames, as I'm sure most of you know, is kind of a very good defensive shortstop for the Tampa Bay Rays. Maybe not their best hitter, usually a number 8 hitter or so, sometimes as high as 7, sometimes number 9. And he came up with runners on 1st and 3rd. They're down 1 run, and the infield is shifted. The first baseman is holding the runner on 1st, and there's no one else on the right side of the infield. And that's the tying run on 3rd base. And I think there was either nobody out or 1 out. And just an open invitation to hit the ball to the right side, push a bunt, do something, get the run home from 3rd base any way you can. And I can hear my old baseball coaches in my ear telling me, don't come back to the bench if you don't get that guy home. And Willie Adames proceeded to strike out, swinging for the fences on pitches that all seemed to be intentionally on the outside corner or off the plate to the outside. Never an attempt on his part to hit the ball the other way. And the Dodgers clearly knew that because they were pitching him away. They weren't even pitching him into their own shift. And we're all scratching our heads saying, what's going on? This isn't the game we all knew. And what are the differences? So I started looking at statistics on that. And last year, 33.7% of at-bats ended up without a ball in play. That's more than a third of the at-bats, of plate appearances, ended up without a ball in play. The strikeout rate was at an all-time high. The walk rate was at an all-time high. Home run rates, really over the last 2 years, were at an all-time high. And as a result, there are fewer and fewer balls in play. Bunt attempts and stolen base attempts are at an all-time low. And so we really have turned to the money ball game. We've turned to the power game, Earl Weaver baseball, 3-run home runs. And a lot of us are feeling baseball's losing something. I also mentioned just a couple other statistics before I start passing this on. The time Major League Baseball has done a lot of in-depth study of this, and I'm really, really glad to have Alan Nathan here in our audience, and I'm hoping he's going to chime in on things as well, because Alan has been helping to advise Major League Baseball on a lot of things related to the baseball and how things react. But baseball has been doing pretty in-depth studies of this for the last couple of years, and I've had the pleasure and good fortune of knowing people at the Mariners through my past life, and having a chance to talk to John Stanton, who's the chairman of the competition committee for Major League Baseball, about some of the things they're looking at. And they're looking really hard at these things because of a number of factors. Number one is, the length of the game has grown by over 30 minutes since the 1970s. So just in the last 40 to 50 years. The time between balls in play, and baseball actually tracks this. And since in the decade of the 1950s, the time between balls in play was roughly 2.5 minutes, and now we're up to almost 3.5 minutes between balls in play. And you can imagine what I mean, we all feel that, but it's interesting to see that the data actually backs up what we're all sensing. So I thought first thing we do before we start to talk about ideas and solutions is kind of help define the problem. So I wanted to kind of go around our panelists and give them each a chance to speak a little bit about how they see the game evolving and changing. Mark, I'm gonna put you on the spot to begin with, just because you've come first in alphabetical order. But give us a sense of how you're feeling about the game.
Okay. Obviously, love the game, like everybody here does. Otherwise, I wouldn't really be on the call. So I do care a lot. And I can only really speak for me personally. I mean, one of the problems with talking about baseball problems is that the person you're talking to might not actually think that the thing that you think is a problem is a problem. So I can really only speak about myself. I don't know what Major League Baseball thinks is a problem, because they have other issues than I do. But in terms of watching the game, the two issues you outlined, which I don't necessarily think are related, are the problem for me. One of which is the pace. The pace of the game is too slow. There's not as much, the action. Even getting the guy to pitch the ball to the batter, the gap between pitches is too long, and that to me is a very solvable problem. And the other, which is maybe less solvable, is that there aren't enough balls in play. So within a single batter, the likelihood that this person is going to hit a fair ball onto the grass, where a fielder can make the play and base runners can run, is never been lower than it is now. And I think, in my lifetime, home runs, come and go. They're high now. And I think even walks come and go, but by far the biggest trend in baseball in the past 30 years is the rise of strikeouts, because strikeouts are not coming and going. They're just coming, and they're coming faster than ever before. The rate of increase in the past decade is more dramatic than at any other time in baseball history. And I think that strikeouts have always increased really for a century, but gradually. And then now it's a little bit off the charts. The current strikeout rate over the last couple of years is essentially the same strikeout rate as Nolan Ryan had in his career. So you're essentially seeing Nolan Ryan against Nolan Ryan in every game you go to now, which is, for me, again, speaking for myself, is too much. The strikeouts are not as spectacular as they used to be, because it's a little bit the expectation. So those are the problems that I see. Not enough balls being hit onto the field of play, and the pace of the game.
Yeah. Rob, you want to join in?
Sure. And first of all, I will just say that I could just repeat every single thing that Mark said from the first word to the last. So I'm going to try to avoid doing that, because I agree with as I usually do with all of that. I did write a book a couple of years ago, which I happen to have handy. And that's basically the central theme of the book, is the rise of power. The book is called Powerball, power pitching, power hitting, obviously. So on a personal level, when I think about how I've enjoyed baseball over the years, the actual game of it, essentially there have always been three primary ways for me to consume it. There was, and is, going to the ballpark, listening on the radio, and watching on television. I still find that going to the ballpark and listening to the radio are as enjoyable as ever. And I think that's because it's easy to fill the time between action when you're at the ballpark or listening on the radio, right? If you're at the ballpark, you're sitting with someone, you're having a conversation. I'm perfectly happy to sit at a 4-hour game if the weather's nice. Why not? Where else would I rather be than at a ballpark? And I have listened habitually to games on the radio during the season, basically from when the games start until I fall asleep at night. And it's just, it remains delightful because I can have baseball and at the same time, I can be doing something else, driving, doing the dishes, whatever it is, eating with my family. Television, though, that has gone away. I don't watch games on TV anymore. And the simple reason is that it just, there's not enough, well, two reasons. One is I have a family, but the other is that there's just there's too much time where nothing is happening. And staring at a screen at nothing, it's just not something that I can really tolerate anymore. And of course, the conundrum for baseball, if I'm not unique, and I don't think that I am, is that in the future, theoretically, video should be more and more how people consume baseball. That's sort of the business model, I think, at least it has been. And yet the game is becoming less entertaining on television than these other ways to enjoy it, again, from my perspective. So I think that, again, while Mark's right, we all these things are personal. I haven't seen any studies yet. Well, I saw one a few years ago. I couldn't track it down about what fans actually want. It's hard to say for sure, but I think that fans want more action. They want to see more triples and stolen bases and great plays at shortstop, those sorts of things. I could be wrong.
You know, I think Rob brings up a really excellent point with the television point there, because there has been such a movement towards television streams as a major source of revenue for teams. And if that's what the business side of things is deciding to focus on, having a game that becomes less and less entertaining on television is going to be a huge problem moving forward. I don't really have a lot to contribute necessarily on what I do and don't like about the game, because, you know, I've been inside for 4 years at this point. I like everything about it, but I see so much of it in person that it's hard for me to have the sort of fan perspective anymore. But I completely agree with Rob that this issue of an exciting television program versus not exciting television program is something that's going to be incredibly important.
John, you're less saddled than some of us with having grown up with baseball 150 years ago. What's your perspective on the home run rate and strikeout rates? Just looking for kind of that younger perspective on this.
Yeah, so I don't mind watching a good pitcher's duel. I don't mind a 1-0 or 2-1 game where you see a lot of strikeouts. I do prefer that those games be quick if I'm going to watch them. I'm not interested in a pitcher's duel that takes 4 hours necessarily. I did grow up in a much higher home run era than I think a lot of people on this call. So the home runs just feel natural to me in a way. Not necessarily from my fandom of the Minnesota Twins in the mid-90s. Not a great time for that particular club. But yeah, strikeouts are certainly something that I've noticed going up and up, not just in data, but in my observation of the game as well. And I've been thinking a lot about what Mark said about them becoming less interesting as they happen more and more. And I think I do agree with that. And it may be because of the sort of type of strikeout that it is, to Rob's book's point, the power pitching rather than a finesse pitcher or someone who knows how to get a batter out. It's everyone relying on high velocity and relying on hitters sort of having a different approach than they used to.
Yeah, Rob brought up a question of kind of speculating on what fans want, and I'm sitting here happy to have some data on Major League Baseball's fan surveys. And this was fascinating to me because it's not really where I expected it to come out. The number one thing that fans want to see more of is triples. That actually rated top. 85% of fans in their survey want more triples. Next was doubles. Next was stolen base attempts. And so this is what fans want. They do want action. I was very reassured to see that, because I personally think the triple may be the most exciting single play in baseball. Although I'm still in the Branch Rickey era of watching, hit and runs go on. But I thought that was really telling. Home runs were down the list. They were fourth. Outfield assists was essentially on a par with wanting to see more outfield assists, on a par with home runs. And singles right after that. So the fans definitely want more offense. That's clear. Is they don't want the defensive battles, but they want more exciting kind of balls in play type offense, and that seemed to be what was coming out of that. What fans wanted fewer of were the things that slow the game down: mound visits, pitching changes, and walks. And I thought that was pretty telling.
Well, and I think that I had not seen those numbers. I've been hearing since I was a little boy that the triple is the most exciting play in baseball, right? And I don't know how many people really believe that, but it's always been said. I think there's at least a kernel of truth to it. And as I mentioned in the book, in 2017, the Blue Jays hit 5 triples to set a new record for the fewest triples by a team in a season. Now that was an outlier a little bit, but it is true certainly that triples are down. And it's probably simplistic to say this, but it seems to me that if you have the thing that people say is the best thing in the whole game, and there's fewer of them than there ever have been before, you might conclude from that you've got an issue, right? And I think that people have concluded that, just not enough people who can change those numbers significantly in the short term. I think we're on the right. There are people who are thinking that way, and we're probably on the right track, but there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah. Well, and with fans wanting more triples, doubles, and singles, that kind of gets us into the question. And John, I may look to you on this. The emphasis the last few years, and what we hear so much about, and I think it's true in Major League clubhouses, is launch angle. Players reinventing their swings to change their launch angle, to change the way they hit the ball, to hit the ball, with a little bit more of an uppercut, hit the ball with a little more backspin, try to get the ball to carry further. And all of those things, at least to me, and we have a good physicist in our audience here. I am not one. But to me, they are antithetical. Launch angle is antithetical to hitting more singles, doubles, and triples. I mean, you're gonna get more fly balls, and more of them are gonna carry out. And the singles, doubles, and triples are the ones where you're either squaring the ball, straight on, or you hit even with a little topspin. And so, what do people think about that? Is part of the problem how we're incentivizing the swing?
Bart, a number of questions to that are piling up here. So may I read a few here?
Sure.
One from Steve Steinberg: I do not understand why players are not going the other way. The history of the game has been one of adjustments and counter adjustments. Why have hitters not adjusted to seemingly obvious ways of getting on base? Other comments: I suspect we all know about the problem. And Steve, what can you do to suggest a solution? Because hitters aren't, the answer is from another person. I won't put everyone's name to all these here, because they aren't trained to do so. Hitters do what they've been trained to do and rewarded by their management from doing it. Okay. I think it's opportunity cost. Home runs are so valuable, especially with the high percentage of balls in play turning into outs, that it's not worth adjustments to making that approach. Okay. One comment from WAG here is bunt singles to a place vacated by the fielders do not make the highlights on ESPN. Okay. People say they want more triples. I doubt it. San Francisco built a park with triples alley, and fans complained about the lack of homers.
If I might jump in just on that point, because I wanted to sort of put my interpretation on the things that fans are saying they wanted. I don't think it's a matter of triples. I think it's a matter of plays where the outcome isn't known immediately. There, you know that a strikeout is an out. You know that a home run is a run scoring play. But all these balls in play, I think the connecting factor is that there is some question of what the outcome is going to be. And that goes to the outfield assists being on the list as well. Fans want to see something not predictable, or at least not known in advance. Sorry, continue.
John, I'd like to come back to you on some of this in terms of today's players and what what they're encouraged to do. Are there active efforts to get more guys to hit the other way, or is it really just to continue to play to their own strengths?
I think we definitely have been encouraging players to play to their own strengths. I think we're running into an issue here of the incentives of sort of the entertainment product being different than the incentives of the team that's trying to win. As much as fans might want to see uncertainty, we want to see a home run from every batter, right? Like if we're trying to win the most games and score the most runs, we don't want that uncertainty per se. And so this is a sort of fundamental opposition that's going to be hard to overcome without maybe making some different types of adjustments to incentives.
I wanted to push back on one thing. I think it's pretty common, at least in my lifetime, that if the game evolves in a certain way, that there is a tendency to, essentially blame the players, say that the players need to do this or the players need to do that. I think, in fact, that the players and the coaches and the analytics departments actually know what they're doing. I mean, the pitcher's job is to strike people out. It is not to make the game more fun. The hitter's job is to do whatever he can do to score more runs. And if that is to use launch angle, then that's what he's going to do. The coach's job is to get the hitters to be better and the pitchers to be better. The analytics department's job is to figure out a way to win games. It is not their job to try and make the game more fun. I think that the only way you can solve any of these problems is not to tell the hitters to bunt. It is, assuming you want the game to change, it's not going to be from the team employees. It's going to be from changing the rules. I mean, if you want to change the rules or change the equipment or change some of the distances, I mean, you may all think this is all stupid. But that's the way it happens.
It's not theoretical. We've seen it many times, right? Throughout the 1960s, I can show you articles from Baseball Digest where people are saying the problem is the hitters aren't good enough anymore.
Right.
And they need to make adjustments. And finally, after 5 or 6 years of this, baseball finally said, no, it isn't that the hitters aren't good enough. It's that the game has changed. So we need to change the game back. And they lowered the mound. And that's happened throughout the history of the game until the last 15 or 20 years. The height of the mound was changed. The baseballs were changed. The strike zone was changed. The spitball was banned, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so it takes a while for people to figure out that the hitters aren't going to make the adjustment, but they do figure it out, then they do something, and that's what hasn't happened in recent decades.
Yeah, and you can see this happening in other sports. It's a very common thing that baseball's, the best thing about baseball is its history, and that's also its curse, because no one wants to change anything. Whereas, this is an old cliche. I'm not the first person to ever say this, but if football had these problems, they would just have a meeting and they would change the rules, and that would be that. They would add a 2-point conversion, or they would change the goalpost, or move the kickoff.
Want to send this?
The NBA added a 3-point play, and they've changed the rules over and over and over again. And baseball has a cow. We just don't like any change, and we're in a situation now where I think change is necessary, and it is for a lot of people painful.
Yeah. And to frame this, and then I want to move on to some of the rule adaptations that we might talk about. But to frame this, I mean, clearly we are seeing the game change. Players are bigger, they're faster, they're stronger. But to me, especially watching this over the last 10 years, you know, and obviously ballparks have not only stayed the same, but if anything, they've shrunk a bit in recent years. The equipment has stayed largely the same, although there are small alterations. But the biggest change to me in the last 10 years is the advance of sports science and the training methods that players use. You know, this isn't the old days where, you know, in the off season, the guy, you know, was driving a UPS truck or baling hay or something like that to try to stay in shape. Now they all have personal trainers and they're hard at work on these, and they have swing doctors reinventing their swing, or they are going to driveline baseballs here in the Northwest to change their pitching mechanics and add a couple miles an hour. There are so many things that players are doing in the nature of sports science, and it does make a huge difference. I mean, we're really seeing it. Any thoughts or reactions?
Well, I mean, I think the one thing I would say is that to this point, it's been pretty clear that all the sports science has favored the pitchers rather than the hitters, which only exacerbates or accelerates the strikeout rate. That seems pretty clear to me. I'm sure somebody would argue with me, and I know that some real strides have been made in the last few years with hitter-centric technology. But I think we're still, for the most part, the pitchers have more tools that are helpful for their development. Honestly, I just maybe that can change. Maybe the ability to hit 100-mile-an-hour fastballs will to learn to hit those fastballs will outpace the ability of pitchers to throw them or learn to throw them. I don't know, but it seems unlikely, which is why I think that most of the time when we're talking about changes, we are talking about bringing the pitchers back down a little bit. But no, I think it's had a huge impact. The fact that there are so many more pitches thrown more than 100 miles or more than 95 now than there were 10 years ago. Part of that is physical development, pitchers being bigger, but I think significant piece of it, I don't know how much, is just due to different training methods that are assisted by technology, no question.
I agree with Rob's assessment that it's been pitcher centric so far. And I think that's just the nature of what technology has existed to this point. The TrackMan, and before that PitchFX, and now Rapsodo, which makes the whole system portable and you can take it to any mound you want to take it to, is all very, very pitcher focused. And just now, something that's new at T-Mobile Park for us to use for hitters is a motion cap, and for pitchers as well, but more of a motion capture video-based system that we can actually start to sort of do the same things with batters and swing paths and swing planes, and sort of catching them up technologically speaking to where pitchers have been for 10 years now.
I'd like to move us on to talk about some of the rule changes and adaptations that we've seen to date. And then we're going to have a third segment, just so the audience knows where we're going with this, on other things, other rule adaptations, other things that have been talked about or considered that we might do in the future. But let's first look at some of the reactions to date. Okay, first of all, we toss a baseball now every time it hits the ground. It's out of the game. We bring in a new baseball, obviously rubbed up by the umpire in theory, and into the game. Does that help, hurt? What's the impact, and what do we think about that?
Bart, I have a number of people commenting on that here. Maybe I could speak for a second.
Sure.
One from Alan Nathan: getting rid of infield shifts would help incentive batters to go for low launch angle line drives rather than home runs. From another, yes, the only solutions are rule equipment changes. Okay. Others saying that wouldn't work for modern hitters. A century ago, many fans complained about the death of inside baseball. Young fans embraced the new game inspired by Babe Ruth. Our perceptions being voiced at this session shared by younger fans, those in their 30s or younger, who love the game they are growing up with. Baseball's attempted solutions to some of these problems have been lucrative, especially the extra inning ghost runners. That's totally antithetical to the rules and the operation of the game. Same, by the way, with moving the mound back through raising or lowering it is okay.
Okay, well, we're going to get into some of those. Let's talk about some of these, but let's go through some of the adaptations today. So putting new baseballs in, my reaction is that we've gone to an extreme. I understand the principle of it. We don't want balls that are cut or badly tainted, and why not? But it clearly does slow the game down, although maybe just marginally. But it also changes the drag coefficient of a baseball. I mean, if you have baseballs that don't have any roughing up on them, number one, you make it more difficult for pitchers to grip, and so you have more pitchers trying to sneak pine tar out to the mound with them. But you also have balls that carry better as a result. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think you're exactly correct about that. And that there is a chance that if we were to use fewer baseballs, just by virtue of the balls getting beaten up a little bit, we might see fewer balls going over the fence.
I'm not sure about the pine tar thing, only because my take on it is that pitchers are going to get away with they're going to do whatever they can get away with. I mean, if they can use pine tar, and right now, I mean, there's estimates that 70% of the pitchers are cheating, and that may be low. And I expect they're doing it to get more spin. And I don't know that that's going to stop unless you change, do different policing. I expect that's just going to happen.
I mean, for me, my take on changing the baseball is that while it might be a good idea, it's only a good idea as part of a holistic approach to all of this. And I'm not the first one to suggest that if all you're doing is deadening the baseball, you're going to wind up with a lot more strikeout centric pitchers duels and low scoring games. And as we all know, fans aren't wild about low scoring games. That's been proved many times over the last century. They like high scoring games with lots of action. And it's not at all clear that simply deadening the baseball. Now, I understand that if you went to somebody at MLB and said, this isn't enough, they would say, yes, you're right, but it's what we can do now. I understand that, but I worry that it sets up an expectation that if we just do this one thing, which is a big thing, by the way, to change the baseball, that we'll get where we want to be. I almost wish there was someone who could give sort of a fireside chat for all the baseball fans in America and say, look, this is what we want to do. This is how we get there. This is the first step or the second step or whatever it is, but there are many more steps to come. We hope that in 5 years, we have the brand of baseball that you all want to see. But right now, it just sort of seems piecemeal and haphazard. And if there's a plan, the fans haven't been told. And I think that that's what I think we're missing, is a holistic approach that's being communicated. I'm not seeing that.
How about designated hitter in both leagues? That was obviously something was put in for the short season last year. They attempted to do it this year. It wasn't going to be agreed upon at this stage by the Players Association, but I think it's something I think everybody expects to see down the road. Thoughts about how that affects the game?
I find it pretty charming, I guess, to have two different sets of rules. Like, I sort of prefer that from a personal point of view, but I do think that pitchers hitting does not help some of these issues that we have.
Right. I think that I've always been sort of the anti-DH person, and that has sort of faded over time because the the ability of pitchers to hit keeps getting worse and worse and worse. I mean, in the 70s and 80s, you used to say like, well, this guy, this guy could hit 220 or this guy could hit 190. And those days are long gone. I mean, the pitchers today is just kind of a joke. It's really just an out. And no one wants their pitcher to be on the bases either. There are teams, there are pitchers that have joked that, if I, got a hit, my manager will be mad at me because now I have to run the bases and they don't want me to do that. So it's a little bit weird now, I think.
Yeah. I see that Ryan Schroer in the chat says that interleague play has shown the need for only one set of rules. And I agree with that. I also, as a just personal opinion, that should not be taken to represent the views of anyone else. I wish we didn't have interleague play so much.
And I agree. To me, interleague play, what's a joke is the fact that American League pitchers have to hit when they play in National League parks and they haven't picked up a bat all game, and suddenly they have to find a bat to take batting practice with the week before. That does make a mockery of the game.
Yeah, I think that the pitchers hitting ties back into what was being said earlier about sort of like the development of players and what they're being trained to do. We're just so far removed from pitchers ever having to be good at that at this point, to Mark's point, they just don't have that skill in the way that they used to.
Yeah, we would love for that to happen, right? Wouldn't it be fun if there were a bunch of pitchers who hit like Don Newcomb and Don Drysdale, but they don't, and we're not going to. We don't have the ability to make them do that. So we should stop pretending that it's going to happen.
Well, because there's a DH in high school. I mean, a lot of these people just basically haven't hit for 10 years.
Right. Yeah, and frankly, I find that more troubling. I mean, I wish we didn't have a DH in lower levels of baseball so that the kids growing up would develop all the skills, because you never know. I mean, look at the players through Major League Baseball history who started as pitchers and became hitters. I mean, Babe Ruth, Stan Musial, George Sisler. I mean, we have Hall of Famers who began as pitchers, and today, it's just the real exotic one, a Rick Ankiel or someone like that.
And why don't we make pitchers hit in high school and college? Is it just is it part of the? And I know this is overblown, and I've sort of backtracked a little in my own thinking over the years, but it seems like a participation trophy situation, right? We just want to get as many kids into the game as we can, and if we have a DH, that means 10 kids get to play. There's no practical reason why high school pitchers shouldn't hit that I can think of.
I think some of it's probably what you said, but don't you think some of it is? And this is gonna sound more harsh than I intended. That we sort of treat pitchers like a Fabergé egg, even at that age. Like, we don't want the pitchers to have to exert themselves. I mean, they come on the bench, they put on a jacket, they sit there and they get toweled off. And I think that managers kind of like the idea that the pitcher can just chill for, the half inning.
Right. That could be.
Well, and I think that gets us back to the power game that we're in. Everything a pitcher does today is max effort. Max effort for as long as you can go, and then get him out and bring someone else in to go max effort. When you are hitting, you're running the bases, you don't get to have that recovery time between innings, and max effort becomes more challenging. And I say that as a senior baseball league pitcher who normally hits, but I never hit the games I pitch.
So I saw someone in the chat suggested that we limit the number of pitchers on a major league roster to 11. Do you think that would sort of solve that problem that we're talking about now, about being able to go max effort all the time? I mean, I could give an opinion, but there's all of us here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a dangerous thing to try. Like, I think that in a vacuum, I agree with you. You'd basically be telling all of the pitchers on a staff, okay, you're gonna have to be used more often now, or you're gonna have to go longer in games. So therefore, when you go out today, make sure you don't try quite as hard. in the first inning as you're used to, because we need to go further. And I think that theoretically that's a good idea. I think that I would prefer pitchers went longer and relief pitchers as well. But I think it's more likely that they would just do what they always do and they would just get hurt. That's the problem.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Mark. And I think that's where what the result would be, which is, you know, a deleterious result. I would love to see pitchers, you know, back to the day where you had to pace yourself because you knew that you know, you were expected, if not a complete game, to at least get through 7 innings. And you couldn't just rear back and go max effort, pitch after pitch after pitch. Of course, if we go to the designated hitter in both leagues, you now have 9 hitters you have to go hard after. Where in the National League game, frankly, it's really 7 because you pitch around the 8th to get to the 9th. Let's talk about the 3 batter minimum for relief pitchers. As long as we're talking about numbers of pitchers in your bullpen, that's something that actually does have an impact on that. Thoughts on that? People in favor? Against?
I think
go ahead, John.
I'll be quick. Just that I think it is an easy way to solve some of the pacing problems that we're talking about, especially when it's not applied to sort of it's not applied to between inning situations. It's just like within an inning, there's 3 batter minimum. I think that does sort of solve that frequent pitching change issue. And it maybe changes the player pool a little bit because you lose the lefty 1-out guy, but they could also just try to be better and be able to get the other side out too.
Yeah, I think it's basically a good idea. I think it was maybe oversold because I think it created the impression in people's heads that the reason why the game was slow was because we were taking out too many pitchers in the middle of the inning. And that's not really why. So I think people thought, oh, the game's gonna be a lot faster now. I actually think it's better because I think it's a little bit more fun to have a guy come in and know that, you know, this guy's there for 3 guys. I think that as a fan, I enjoy that more. I don't think it speeds the game up though.
I think it speeds the September game up, but other than that, it doesn't have a huge effect.
Right.
But it definitely does in September and probably in the playoffs as well, when you would otherwise get those multiple pitching changes in a single inning. And now you have less of that. Anything to me that takes away that time of pitching change, including, you know, making the manager signal from the dugout, not walk out there and pace around, giving the guy 7 more warm-up pitches in the bullpen, is helpful. So I like the 3 batter minimum, and I, having been a pitcher, I think pitchers should be able to get left-handed and right-handed hitters out, or go back to the minor leagues and learn how to. What about the extra inning shootout that we tried last year? I guess we're not going to have this year, but I think we'll be on the table this fall. Putting a runner on second base to start the 10th inning.
Well, I will say it's not the end of the world, clearly. My problem with it is that from a personal perspective, literally my favorite baseball game is the marathon game, right? And I know maybe I'm sure that's a minority opinion, but to me, there's nothing more fun than a game that's going 16, 17, 18 innings. And that just poof is gone. So it's demoralizing. I mean, it's like people complained about the 4-ball and the having to throw four balls for an intentional walk. How much are we going to, did people really miss that when it was gone? I would say pretty much not at all. But I think there are people like me who miss those long games. And honestly, I don't really see the practice. When you have 14-man pitching staffs, it's hard for me to see how that really helps people stay healthy, what have you. And I realize that there have been situations where teams ran out of pitchers, but that's because of all the pitching changes. So I don't know. I'm not wild about it. I get it. It's not the end of the world, but I'm not a fan.
Mark?
Yeah, I guess I feel the same way. I don't think it didn't really bother me that much. I thought it would bother me more. I think if I was a retro sheet scorer like I used to be, it would have freaked me out a little bit, like how to deal with this, because of all these things you can do with the 7-inning games that we had last year as well. There people would say, well, you could actually have like a walk off. You could have a walk off. The second batter in the inning can have a walk off single in the 7th inning, or the first batter in the inning rather, and so there's a lot of sort of that kind of craziness. But when I actually sat down and watched it, it didn't really bother me as much as I thought. If I'm at the park, sort of like echoing what Rob said earlier, I just assume the game lasted forever. So I don't really need that. But maybe if I'm watching on a Saturday afternoon, it's a little different.
Neil Travin says in the comments, and this is true, that in theory a pitcher could throw a perfect game and lose under these circumstances.
Yeah,
so
well,
from a
Alex came
personal
close.
yeah, I speaking only from a personal point of view, because I don't want to represent the views of the Mariners on this or anything like that. I have a big theoretical problem with it, in that I prefer being able to better account for everyone who got on base, like earning their way on base rather than just being placed there. I also agree that having watched it, it didn't throw me as much as I thought it was going to. I disliked it a lot more in concept than I did in practice.
I will mention that just from data that I have, the percentage of the games that ended it worked from what they wanted to accomplish. The percentage of games ending in the 10th inning last year of extra inning games was 70%, where historically the percentage of games ending in the 10th inning was typically in the 40 to 48% range. So it had a dramatic impact. My personal view is I'm okay with it, kind of like you guys. I'm okay with it, but I'd rather not see it in the 10th inning or maybe even the 11th. I might wait till the 12th. I mean, at least let's have some fair opportunity to win the game legitimately, or however you want to term that. But allow at least 1 or 2 innings to play out. I've heard other people suggest that they'd be okay with it, but let's start at the top of the order every time. Every inning should start at the top of the order. I don't like that suggestion at all.
I kind of think baseball should be less scared of ties as a possible solution to this problem. I'd personally rather keep rules the same and just change the outcomes that are possible. If you don't want the game going past the 12th inning, just say if you can't win by the 12th, then you don't get the win as a team.
Well, in the old days, some of these times they would cut off the games after a certain time because the White Sox had to catch their train or something like that. And they would just
Or dark.
Yeah,
or dark.
yeah,
or curfews. Yeah, I can remember curfews. Yeah, but I think every one of us has a memorable game that we attended that went, 18 or 19 or 21 innings, and those do stick with you. And I forget whose book it was who wrote the book about the Pawtucket game a few years ago, but it was just a fascinating study of a game that had to be suspended and come back and continue in the morning because of curfews. So.
Yeah, I went to a game in Boston once. I have no idea how many innings it was, but it was a lot. And I was meeting people after the game downtown. And of course, I didn't have a cell phone. It was before cell phones. So there's really no way to, and I was meeting people who would have no idea that this was happening, that this was a Red Sox game was going on, because they didn't care. And I eventually showed up, but it was like an hour or more late. And they didn't understand my explanation that I couldn't leave the game. Like, there was just not a possibility. Like, you weren't that good of friends that was going to get me to leave the game. And they thought that was sort of absurd. It's like, well, sorry, couldn't leave the game.
Yeah. But I can tell you, as someone having worked for the Mariners for a number of years, where you're attending most games in person, I can remember sitting there in the 10th, 11th, 12th inning saying, is this thing ever going to be over? Because I've got to get home and I got to be back in here in 7 hours. And there are a lot of staff who feel that way. A lot of the people working the ballparks, and are wondering if they're ever going to get home. And especially when you have a night game before a day game, it can be pretty impressive.
Well, you can remember in Ball 4, Jim Bouton said that the veterans would get mad if in spring training, if one of the rookies drove in a tying run in the 9th inning, they'd be like all over the kid.
Okay, let's talk about time clocks for a minute. We currently have a time clock between innings, but not on the pitchers. So let's talk about both aspects of using a time clock. That clearly, can help in some ways in terms of just the overall length of the game and the pace of the game. I guess if you're sitting there watching and you're kind of bored between innings or between pitches. Thoughts about time clocks?
Well, I'll just briefly talk about both of those. I know on the between innings thing, my long ago colleague Brant Brisby wrote something a couple of years ago that I quoted in my book extensively. The between innings thing, we used to talk about. I talked about this for years, saying that the reason games are so long these days is because there are so many more commercials. And I just said that because it seemed like an obvious truth, right? The problem is it wasn't true. What happened in the old days is they'd have 2 minutes of commercials or a minute and a half, whatever it was. Then they'd come back to the game on TV, and then you'd watch the players screw around for 30 seconds before they started playing. They hadn't sold the commercial time, but they could have, because nobody was doing anything. It takes X number of seconds or minutes to make the exchange of teams, right? So, and do all the things that they do. So the between innings thing, sure, there are a few extra seconds you can save here and there, but really it's not a significant factor in the longer games. The time between pitches is huge, as you know. That number has gradually expanded to go from, I don't know what the average was. Grant actually wrote about this too. It was probably between 10 and 15 seconds back in the 70s, and now it's between 15 and 25 seconds, somewhere in that range, around 20. With some pitchers averaging 25 to 30 seconds between pitches. And there has been forever a rule on the books about that. And I talked to Dale Scott, who umpired in the major leagues for 30 years, about this one time. And he told me, yeah, every few years we would get an edict from the league headquarters saying, okay, this is the year, boys. We're going to enforce that time limit between pitches and make the batters stay in the box, et cetera, et cetera. The umpires would issue a few warnings. They would be ignored. They would send a report to the league. And then the league said, well, we can't really do anything about it. So you cannot enforce the limit, which is in the books. You cannot enforce those clocks without complete buy-in from the players, and they simply have not been able to get that. And this fight goes back again decades. So without the players, without the union, you can't do anything about it. You just can't.
Yeah, I think that's a great historic perspective on it. The standard for breaks between innings is 2 minutes and 5 seconds. It gives you 5 seconds to get out of the game, and then 2 minutes of commercials, and you come back and join it. But and it has been that way for a while. I think they expanded it by 15 seconds, something like 20 years ago. So there's been a slight extension, but not very much. But for national games, it's 2:35. So if you have a national broadcast game, Major League Baseball does extend those by 30 seconds.
Right.
There is an extra 30-second commercial spot in there for obviously financial reasons. And so that is a place. They are talking about going to a minute 45 from that 2:05. And they're even talking about the possibility of doing what I think we've seen the NBA do, and maybe even football, where you come back and you finish your commercial, but you have a side-by-side box, and the play actually starts while the last commercial position is still running. So if they want to, they might go to 145, but whoever bought that commercial position is going to get a side-by-side commercial while the first pitch is being thrown to the next hitter. So it is one of the things they're looking at. Rob, I think the only way to get player buy-in is actually to a fixed rule where you just simply put a time clock on the pitcher, and if he doesn't pitch, it's a ball. Or if the hitter's not in the box, the pitcher's told to throw, and the umpire calls a strike, or the pitcher or the hitter has to jump in at the last second. I mean, that would cure it pretty quickly.
Yep.
But I think you'd have to have the buy-in to the rule change, and then you give the umpire a standard to enforce,
Right.
and it's no longer subjective. But you're right. The studies that baseball have done show the number one factor in terms of changing the length of games is pitchers holding the ball longer. And some of it may be the hitter's not in the box. If the hitter's not in the box, the catcher doesn't give the signs. And so some pitchers are towing the rubber waiting for the hitter to get in the box. But mostly it's watching guys like Pedro Baez pacing around the back of the mound talking to the baseball. The restriction on mound visits. Okay, we saw that a couple of years ago, limiting the number of mound visits to 6. I'm a big fan of that one, so I throw that out to you guys. Other thoughts, other opinions?
Long overdue, way overdue. I mean, there was a game, a World Series game. I don't remember the specifics, but in the first inning or two, I believe it was the Yankees. The Yankees catcher went out to the mound like 8 times, just in the first couple of innings. Ridiculous. It's incredible to me that baseball hadn't outlawed that long before. There was no reason for it. Couldn't be more thrilled. I mean, for all I care, they could drop it from whatever it is now by half, and it'd still be fine. Nothing's really accomplished except giving the pitcher a break and a guy in the bullpen more time to warm up most of the time. So no, the fewer the better.
Right. I agree with Rob. I mean, there's no reason to go to the mound at all, frankly, except to buy time. That's the reason why you go. You saw that in Bull Durham, right? They don't talk about anything important. They're not really discussing strategy or anything. If having grown up, we all grew up playing baseball, and nobody ever went to the mound and on the sandlots. It is, I'm obviously not going to get my way, but I mean, I almost feel like you should never go to the mound. Like, what's the point of going to the mound ever? Calling a pitcher, keep your ass in the dugout. But that's not going to change.
There are a million stories, right, of managers going to the mound and looking the pitcher in the eye, and the pitcher says, "I can get this guy, Skip. Let me have him." And the manager changes his mind. That's fine. There's a place in the game for that, no question. But there's less of a place for it now than there used to be, because so many of the changes are based purely on how many pitches the guy has thrown or who's coming up next. So I don't see a need to outlaw mound visits, but limiting them and preventing catchers from going out there 6 or 8 times in one inning. And oftentimes they'll say it's because they're worried about sign stealing. You know what? Get it together. Figure it out before the game starts. Have a system. So I have no sympathy for that kind of thing. The manager, the pitching coach going out there 3 or 4 times a game, sure. It's part of the game's history and its color. That's great, but limits are necessary at this point.
Yeah, and the best thing they did, in my view, with limiting that was making the catcher visits count against the manager's visits. So now the catcher doesn't go out without looking and getting permission.
Right.
Because you're right, it was the Yankees, and Gary Sanchez was going to the mound literally every batter. I remember that well. It's like, what's going on? Okay. Instant replay. Let's talk about the impact of instant replay in the pace of the game. Clearly does create an interruption. but we always had interruptions for arguments. So are they just is it just a trade-off?
I think it's probably a trade-off. I think that the arguments, if anything, the arguments probably occasionally went longer than the time for instant replay. I doubt it's been really that impactful. I think the instant replay could be a lot quicker than it is. I mean, it could take seconds to do instant replay.
Right.
They shouldn't have to go back to New York at all. They just have a fifth umpire up in the booth that watches the replay once. I mean, the fans at home can make the decision in like 5 seconds, and then sometimes it takes a minute and a half to go back to New York. I see no reason to do that. I don't know. That's my take.
Yeah, my sense is that they've gotten much better with instant replay now that the managers and their video coordinators have quick access to this, and they get a signal very quickly. I mean, within typically 5 to 10 seconds, the manager makes a decision, and they're not doing the frivolous challenges anymore. I mean, that to me was the key. In the early days, the first few years of this, we had a lot of really frivolous challenges, just taking a shot. And I think that's limited. So I'm kind of okay with it. I think it can certainly keep getting better.
Right. I mean, they're only, as the technology gets better and they streamline the process, it's only going to get quicker. Right. And by the way, the umpires are better than they've ever been before. They're just more skilled. They're in better position. They're in better shape. So theoretically, as we move forward, you should have quicker reviews and not as many reviews, I think. So I think that, and not to mention the fact that it's of all the things that we've talked about, it's the one thing that's almost non-negotiable in the sense that we can't go backwards, right? We can't get fewer calls right. The fans just won't. The fans and the players also just won't. They won't tolerate more. They won't tolerate fewer correct calls now they've gotten used to having the system in place.
Yeah. Bob, is there anything coming in from? I'm sure I see the chat line.
There's more stuff. There's more stuff that I can.
I don't want to ignore that, and certainly other people's views.
There's more stuff than I can keep up with. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff here. I've seen mentions of John McGraw, Eddie Plank, Chief Bender, hard-hitting pitchers like CC Sabathia and others there. One question here from Bill Woodward here, he's repeated. A marketing question, referring to you, Bart. Years ago, I heard Bart say to my students that MLB was competing for audiences against other sports and other entertainment options. The marginal fan is the swing vote. Among 3 classes, who do clubs try most to woo? Hardcore fans, fair weather fans who will support a winner, or casual attendees? And where do marketers want to prompt those folks to engage in the seats as attendees or as television viewers?
As usual, Bill asks the questions that can't be answered. I'd say baseball is after everybody. They certainly don't want to alienate the hardcore fans like us, but they also know we're probably the last who are going to leave. Baseball has a lot of inventory to sell when you look at it. The Mariners start the year with 3.7 million tickets to sell. And that's that's way more than any other sport has to contend with because of the 162 game season, and large venues. So you can't survive on the hardcore baseball fan alone. I mean, the teams just can't do it in today's economics. You have to have repeat fans. You have to have customers who will buy 10 game, 20 game packages of games to go to it. Not just season ticket holders, but those who share season tickets or are repeat fans, those who bring their families, and I think baseball now, and probably more than I've ever seen it in the past, is trying to be sensitive to the next generation. you know, they don't want baseball to be a game for a bunch of guys who look like me, baby boomers who are going to age out of their population before long. They want it to be young fans. So they want to keep fans. Baseball knows that with fans, it runs a cycle. Kids love baseball, and you have kids through Little League, and baseball is an easy sport to go out and play catch with your dad and hit a ball off a tee and start doing those little things. It gets tougher when you get to about age 13, and you and the field grows from the 60-foot diamond to the 90-foot diamond. And I guess now they actually they graduate that. We used to have to jump from 60 to 90, and it was almost impossible. And you lost a lot of kids at that age. And then you lost more baseball fans in high school because of the pace of the game. And that's where baseball fans often turn to things that move more quickly, like football or basketball, or sometimes it was cars and girls and other things that grab your attention when you're 16, 17 years old. And then you came back to the game at about age 30, when you started to have kids. So I know from the standpoint of the marketers and the people who are selling product around baseball, they want certain age demographics. I mean, the 18 to 30-year-old male demographic, which is what the soft drink companies want, is not baseball's core audience. Baseball would love to rebuild that core audience. So it's a little bit of everything. Baseball needs it all because of that sheer amount of inventory. So you want to keep the game more entertaining. I mean, it is an entertainment sport, and it's not only for the purists like us, but it's for those who watch it, for pure just that enjoyment. That's part of my title is as we evolve from art to science. I mean, to me, baseball is an art. I mean, to many of us, it's more than an art. It's nearly a religion. But to me, we can't lose. We want the excitement back in it, but we can't lose the artistry either. Now, I'll get off my soapbox. Let others chime in.
Well, I don't disagree with any of that. I think as I've written and many others have, people have been predicting the demise of baseball since the 19th century, and particularly the 1960s. The NBA and the NFL were going to drive baseball out of business, and obviously that didn't happen. And baseball sets new revenue records every single year. So it's certainly possible that baseball will wind up becoming the number 4, number 5 sport in the U.S. because all their fans have died. But again, that's been said forever, and it's never happened. So people do come back to it, just like they come back to bird watching or model trains or whatever it is. There's always going to be a place for baseball. Really, what we're talking about here today is fine-tuning things a little bit, not to make the game popular. Clearly it is popular, clearly it's profitable, but maybe make it a little more popular, a little more profitable, a little more entertaining. We have a luxury of not talking about a crisis, but talking about something that's already thriving, and how can it thrive a little bit more, and frankly make it more entertaining for us personally. That's worth talking about too. But it isn't a crisis. It's just we're talking about some things where it could be. There's nothing wrong with taking something good or great and making it even better.
Okay, I'd like to move us on to talk about things that we might consider in the future. So that's kind of our final but big topic here. Rule changes that have been talked about, we see out in the media, or any other thoughts or ideas people have. I think, to me, the most fertile ground to start with, and probably the biggest topic of all of this, is changing the baseball. And we've already seen baseball making some adjustments this year with trying to tighten the specifications down. There's an article I read yesterday when my Sports Illustrated arrived, talking about the baseball and some recent studies on the baseball. Thoughts about the specifications of the baseball itself, the weight, the tolerances, the changes to the laces, the surface, coefficient of drag, coefficient of resonance. I mean, we've got all these ways of impacting the ball, and my sense is that most of the things we're concerned about with the way the game plays can be handled through the baseball. Mark, I know you've already talked and raised some of this. Why don't you give us some of your thoughts?
Well, I'm going to start by saying that I hesitate to say too much with Dr. Nathan on the call, since he's probably done as much research into the physics of the baseball as anyone alive, and wonderful stuff. I do believe, I think one of the things that I have learned over the past decade or so from reading people like Alan and others is how incredibly sensitive the game is to modifications in the baseball. If you just take that basic fact, which I probably never knew before, that if you raise or if you modify the height of the seams by 5%, or you make the cork 5% springier, or if there's all these little things you can do to the baseball, and suddenly it's like, oh, now it's carrying 15 feet further, or now it's the velocity off the bat is 5 miles an hour less. So without getting into the actual science of it, which I'm not as qualified as other people to talk about, I do believe that what you said is true, that I think it would be helpful to solve the problems that I see in the game, to have the ball travel not as hard, not as far, and not as much velocity, with presumably the spring of the, I don't know even what the term is, of the ball, and also to have it move less out of the pitcher's hands, which I assume would happen with the seams, because anyone goes on to YouTube now can see these pitchers that throw, like I used to try and get wiffle balls to travel in my backyard. So it's not just the throwing 95, but they're throwing 95 with 14-inch horizontal movement, which to me is unfair. So I'm all for modifying the ball to produce the game, and not to be afraid of modifying the ball either, so that if you overcorrect, that you modify it again. And we shouldn't feel like that the specifications of the ball are were passed down by Moses. I think we should feel comfortable tweaking the equipment on occasion to help the game.
John, any thoughts?
Yeah, I was going to say that I just feel pretty happy that there is a recognition that that small variations in the ball can have such a big effect, and hopefully that will lead to tighter manufacturing tolerances. And I know MLB is now, if not the principal owner, then at least a large part owner of Rawlings, making baseballs for Major League Baseball. And I think that's going to be a big step forward, just tightening tolerances and making sure that they stay in spec. And then from that point on, you can decide what you want the spec to be, like sort of take that as the next stage in the process.
Yeah. I'm going to take the liberty. Alan, I know you're still on here. I see you there. If you don't mind unmuting, I'd love to have your thoughts, because you know more about how these impacts work than probably anyone in the country, and get a sense of what are the unintended consequences when we start to do the tinkering? Because I know if you raise the seams, you will change the carry of the ball, but you also may be giving pitchers more movement on the ball when assuming the spin rate stays relatively constant. But you can talk about this much better than any of us can.
Okay, yeah, sure. Glad. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Glad to jump in.
Yeah.
Okay. Look, the things that matter for baseball performance, there's really only a handful of things that you can list that actually matter. The size, the weight, those things matter both for pitching as well as for hitting. And those are very, very easily controllable in the manufacturing process. The thing about the springiness of the ball, the technical term is the coefficient of restitution, the bounciness of the ball, is actually one of the things that Rawlings really, really knows how to control very well. The actual specifications are much wider than they really need to be. In fact, our committee recommended that they actually tighten the specifications to actually reflect reality, the fact that they can manufacture things to a much tighter spec. But okay, so the recent change that was discussed in the SI article and article in the Athletic that appeared a day or so earlier than that was that Rawlings, they didn't tighten the spec. What they did was they had noticed that this coefficient of restitution had started to creep up just a little bit, and they wanted to lower it to bring it to the middle of the specification range. Okay, so those things have predictable effects on the one hand, the size, the weight, and the coefficient of restitution, and they're pretty straightforward to control. The thing that has less predictable effects and is hardest to control are the issues related to the seams. Not just the seam height, but very subtle little things with the seams can really affect how that ball carries, whether you're talking about along the carry of a fly ball or the movement of a pitch. It matters in both cases. Now, it is true, as you said, Bart, that if you raise the seams, that'll increase the air drag on a fly ball, okay, which would decrease the carry of the ball, but would also affect the movement. You would get, the current thought is, more movement on a pitch if the seams are higher. Certainly, with the higher seams, a pitcher could probably spin the ball more. But even aside from whether you could spin it faster, greater RPM, you're probably going to get more movement just because of the seams, the effect of the seams. And this whole thing about seams, this so-called seam shifted wake would have a bigger effect. That's another story altogether. So yeah, given that the ball, especially the last part of the construction of the ball, which is sewing the leather cover on, it's all done by hand. And when things are done by hand, there are variations. And I mean, one of the major things that we found when studying this whole problem was that the ball-to-ball variation in things like seam height was considerably greater than the variation from one year to the other in average seam height. And we really couldn't account for the fact that just the ball-to-ball variations was as large as it was. It's just a natural process. So certainly MLB could change this bounciness factor, the coefficient of restitution. You do that. If you lower it, then you're gonna, the ball's not gonna come off the bat as fast, and you're going to have fewer home runs. There's no question about that. So you decrease exit velocity by 1 mile an hour. That's roughly 5 feet of distance on a long fly ball. It also is going to have some effect on other batted balls. The harder you hit it, the more likely you're going to get on base, whether it's going for a home run or going for a single, either way. So it's a tough problem, and I'm not sure what Major League Baseball has on their mind in terms of whether they really want to make some changes. But I will agree with you on one thing that somebody said. Major League Baseball and Rawlings together are almost paranoid about changes to the ball. Rawlings from time to time has new technology that they use in the manufacturing process, which would improve the things like the uniformity of the baseball. And the question then arises, is it more important to improve the ball, or is it more important to keep the ball exactly where it is? And, MLB struggles with answering that question.
Yeah, and my sense, and I certainly noticed that in my time working with the Mariners, that any suggestion that we do anything with the baseball everyone was just aghast at that idea. And of course, those of us who really read the history know that's happened over the years all the time, not always intentionally, but the ball would change from one inning to the next just simply by leaving it in play longer than we do today. And in the old days, when they often play with the same ball for half a game, they'd be dark and they'd have tobacco juice on them and everything else. We strive for perfection in our game today, but in the actual play of the game, historically, it was never perfect, and often far from it. I'd like to, while we've got Alan kind of on the spot, I want to ask about humidors, because that's another thing that is being used, and I know we're going from 5 to 10 teams using humidors this year, and I also know Major League Baseball is actually encouraging all the teams to consider doing that. Could you help us understand the impact of the humidor?
Sure. The primary thing that the humidor, this coefficient of restitution factor, this bounciness factor, when the ball absorbs water, it gets less bouncy. When it's dry, it gets more bouncy. So left unregulated in a humid environment, like Miami in the summertime, if left out in the environment for a week or so, it would absorb enough water to reduce that coefficient of restitution. The other extreme is Phoenix in the summer, where the relative humidity is very, very low and the balls dry out. So when you store something in the humidor, you're keeping it at a constant temperature and constant relative humidity. I think typically 70 degrees Fahrenheit and maybe 50% relative humidity. So in order to have it at least controlled. In places like Denver and Phoenix, where it's dry, the effect of the humidor storing the balls at 50% was to increase the bounciness, the coefficient of restitution. Was the decrease, said it wrong, to decrease the coefficient of restitution, going from a dry to a more humid environment, which reduced the number of home runs, and that actually happened. If you were to take a baseball in Miami and store it in a humidor at 50%, you'd probably increase the number of home runs because 50% is lower than the ambient humidity in the environment in the summer. So anyway, that's I think the main purpose of the humidor is in a way it gives you another knob to turn in order to try to control the performance of the ball, number one. And number two, it helps assure some sort of uniformity across the league. Prior to a couple of years ago, there was absolutely no rules at all about once the team got a shipment of baseballs and what they did with them, where they were stored, were they stored in a controlled environment, uncontrolled environment. It was only maybe 3 years ago or 2 or 3 years ago where MLB started keeping track of that. So the humidor at least helps enforce some uniformity.
Okay, good to know. Good to know. I'll just make a comment too, as someone who has been a pitcher for much of my life. the direction of the wind is an enormous factor. And of course, as we strive for perfection in baseballs and how they carry, a 3 mile an hour difference in the wind or the wind direction may make more of a factor than almost any of the things we're talking about.
Am I remembering right that that was a big factor in the London series a couple years ago? That was something that the players noticed about the wind effects or lack of wind effects there? Does anyone remember what I'm talking about? Never mind.
I remember it was a thing. Yes, it was a huge thing. I don't remember what the actual effect was, but yeah, it was. Everybody was talking about it at the time.
Yeah, let me just chime in one more time if I can. You're absolutely right about the wind. I mean, that is something totally uncontrolled, right? We have no control over it, except the cover of the stadium, I suppose. But not only that, we have no real way to measure its effect, because you really need to know the direction of the wind and how fast the wind is blowing at every point in the stadium in order to control for it. And it affects not only batted balls, but also pitch balls. And Bart, you probably know that as a pitcher.
Yeah, no question. I mean, most of us who pitched would always actually root for a wind blowing straight out at about 5 miles an hour. So not enough that it's going to carry too many balls out of the ballpark, but enough so it gives you that extra movement on your pitch, because the wind at your back takes away all your movement. And that is the worst thing for a pitcher, is that, maybe it gives you another mile an hour, but everything you throw is straight and the hitters catch up to those. So, yeah. And so our game will never be perfect. And we, as many of the people on this call are real students of the history of the game, know that there are so many variables over time. And, in today's game, we strive for perfection. Our fields are perfect. The gloves are bigger. The players make fewer errors. Everything is striving for this. We don't miss as many umpires calls anymore. But there are always going to be natural conditions that change all these things. Let's move off the baseball for a minute. Sure. Let's talk about shifts. There's talk about limiting shifts. Should we limit shifts? They've clearly had a big impact. And I think this past year, the number of shifts went up to something on the order of 35 to 40% of hitters faced shifts this year, which was way up from previous years. Thoughts about should we limit it, or should we make those damn hitters figure out how to go the other way?
We have a comment, I believe it's from Professor Nathan here as well, saying that if we eliminated shifts, it would encourage batters not to swing for the fences or get the launch angle so much, but to swing for line drives and change the game in that way.
Yeah, I think Alan's trying to put me out of a job because shifting is what I do for the Mariners. No, I'm kidding. No, but I think it should at least be on the table as something that we need to take a look at. If we can all agree that that is part of the problem and that is something that we're trying to solve, then it should at least be in consideration. I'm not sure that I would be in favor of doing it or doing it in the way that it seems to be headed, but it's worth talking about, to be sure.
I do believe we need to create motivation for the hitters to use the whole field, to make contact, to stop trying to hit everything out of the ballpark. And I think there are pros and cons of eliminating the shift. To me right now, if you have half the field open to you, there's a lot of incentive to use the whole field, to go the other way. Imagine Tony Gwynn up in today's world facing a shift. I mean, he'd hit 500. You just so part of me says if you eliminate the shift, then you're creating less motivation to hit the ball the other way. But then I hear Alan's comment, and I hadn't really thought about that, and I think that's actually right. If you eliminate the shift, now Kyle Seager who can't go the other way apparently despite years of trying, has to either hit the ball over them or go back to the bench. And maybe it makes sense. So I think it cuts in both directions.
Here's a rule change that I just occurred to me, and I will present to you. Anyone who wants can take credit for it. With 2 strikes, you get 1 free foul bunt. Okay, so you're down 0-2, can't bunt because you don't want to be out. I've just given you a free pass. So with 2 strikes, you can bunt 1 foul before it counts against you. And that encourages hitters who are behind in the count, already in big trouble. But let's give them 1 shot at bunting and maybe beating the shift.
Interesting.
So I joked about my job being eliminated, and then Ryan brought that up in the chat as well. But then here's Bill Woodward with a very good question, I think. And so where I'm going with this is that if the shift is eliminated, or if there are rules that get put in place about where fielders can stand, in all seriousness, I am still going to be in charge. I'm still going to be the person figuring out what is the optimal place within this set of rules for the fielders to stand. So then Bill asks, what will the penalty be? And I think that becomes an important point of discussion. We are going to push the rules as far as they will allow to get the optimal position for making outs. And so what happens if someone pushes past those rules? What is the penalty? What's the violation there? So worthwhile question, Bill. Another good one.
It's a good question. It will be easy to determine when the rule has been broken with wearable technology, right? That's easy. But the penalty for doing that's tricky. Yeah, you're right.
You actually shock the players.
Well, so I could envision a shortstop standing as close to second base as they possibly can for a left-handed batter. And what happens if they edge over it by an inch a second too early or a half second too early? What's going to happen to the result of that pitch or that ball in play?
You ward first base.
Yeah, maybe that's the answer. I don't know.
So one of the interesting things, I'm sure, John, you can speak to this, but one of the interesting findings over the last few years is there are skeptics who would claim that the shift is not really having the effect that people think it's having, that the batting average in balls in play has not really changed in the last 10 years as these shifts have gone up. What is your take on that?
So Russell Carlton has done a lot of the public work in this area. He's a friend of mine. I know Russell. I tend to not agree with all of his conclusions. I do think that some teams are better at it than others. I like to think that that the Mariners are better at it than average. Sorry, I lost track of what I was saying for a second there, but I
wasn't trying to fire you, by the way.
Yes. No. So I do think that employed correctly, it is very effective. I think there's a tendency within the game from certain people in certain roles to want to sort of follow the trendy thing to look like they are keeping up with the latest innovations in baseball, and that can lead to teams going too far with some of these strategies, and that has probably happened with shifting. But that employed correctly, I do think that it's very beneficial in producing outs that otherwise would not exist.
Well, probably one of the reasons why you could have the shifts helping, but other things hurting at the same time, is the rise of people trying to launch the ball. Because, as you know, most players that have an extreme likelihood to hit ground balls to their pull side do not have an extreme pull pattern on line drives or fly balls. It's like,
yeah,
David Ortiz, who has shifted probably more than any player in recent memory, hit the ball for power everywhere. But when he hit a ground ball, it was almost always between first and second.
Mm-hmm.
So if David Ortiz is hitting fly balls, then the shift isn't going to help.
Yep, I agree. This is something that comes up every year with Mike Trout too, because we talk about whether or not we want to use the right-handed shift against him, and to some degree, if he's going to put the ball on the ground to the now vacated sort of second base spot, that's maybe still a positive outcome for a Mike Trout at bat for us if he's hitting a ground ball rather than hitting a double or a home run.
Right.
Yeah. Let's talk about, let's move off of the shift and talk about the strike zone.
The other thing that's going to put me out of a job is I do the framing stuff too.
Should we be redefining the strike zone? Should we be automating the strike zone call? So there's really two parts to this. And I will say, I've seen kind of Major League Baseball's most recent studies on this. And what they're showing is the way the umpires are calling the strike zone, they are now calling the top of the strike zone pretty consistently in the center. And what the pattern of what the umpires are calling, obviously this is the average, it's not individual umpires, but the average is that they are calling the pitch at the top of the strike zone, but their strike zone is oval. And it really doesn't, they're not calling any of the four corners. The little corners that you imagine an oval circumscribed inside of a rectangle. They are missing all four of those corners, particularly the two top ones. And they're extending the center of the strike zone down low, below the bottom of the strike zone. So that is the average ball strike call right now, is that they are calling the top of the strike zone, they're calling the bottom of the strike zone plus maybe a couple inches below the strike zone, as long as the ball is reasonably centered. But if the ball is out on the edges of the corners, they're really only calling it more into the center of the vertical portion of the strike zone, if you can picture that. Should we be redefining it? Any thoughts? Should and part and parcel of that is and I will confess to having been an early and often advocate of using the automated strike zone. So I have a bias here.
Well, I don't really have a strong opinion about automating the strike zone. I think it's probably inevitable, just as most technology becomes inevitable. And I think that it would be somewhat useful. I've been amazed by how accurate the umpires have been. They're way better than they were 20 years ago. I'm way better for various reasons. But it's incredible when you look at the scores that the umpires get. Most of the time, they're missing, and you can define missing in different ways, but they're missing by at least one measure, sometimes 2 or 3 pitches in a whole game. I mean, think about that accuracy rate. It's incredible. So I'm terribly impressed by today's umpires and their strike zones. But as whether or not we should talk about changing it, of course. I mean, John mentioned shifts being in they should be in the conversation at least. There's nothing that should be in the conversation more than the baseball and the strike zone. And I say that because I also believe that the mound could be toyed with, but that gets into questions of pitchers' health, how pitchers have trained for years and years, and the fact that the mound has been changed really only once in the last 100 years or so. But the strike zone has always been a tool that baseball has used to arrive at desired outcomes. It's incredibly complex, but I think absolutely the strike zone has to be a part of this conversation.
And how would you change it, Rob?
You know, it's funny, I wrote about that in my book and with some ideas, but I don't remember what I wrote except for this. You'd have to be way smarter than I to know how to change it and arrive at the desired outcomes. And you'd have to do some experimentation. I mean, I think that what I recommended was, what did I recommend? I don't even want to try to, I think I recommended lowering it because I think that would help lower the strikeout rate some. But I might have also said you should also widen it or shrink it or something. I don't remember now, but it was just wild speculation. I think really the answer is experiment, do a lot of theory. There is an answer out there, but I haven't seen that answer yet. And again, as I mentioned like an hour and a half ago, it's got to be part of a holistic approach. It's got to be in conjunction with the baseball and the strike zone. I mean, and the outfield fences or the mound, all of it. It's all got to work together.
I think the first year or so after the robot strike zone gets implemented, and I agree with Rob, it's inevitable no matter what we think of whether it should be coming or not. I think it's going to happen. The first year or so is going to be wild to watch because no one has been used to those corners that Bart's talking about being called strikes ever before. And just to see hitters and pitchers react to some of these calls is going to be a very strange experience, I think.
Well, and John, wouldn't you agree that if in isolation, if you just if you start calling those pitches strikes, don't we have a lot more strikeouts than we have now even?
Yeah, I think my instinct about it is that at least for the first couple years, strikeouts are going to skyrocket with the robot strike zone. I could easily be wrong about that, but that's my instinct.
Which takes us in the opposite direction where we're all saying we want to go, which is why I think that you cannot institute an automated strike zone without also changing the strike zone. Have the automated strike zone call the strike zone you want, but you can't, not the one we have now, not the official strike zone, or it'd be a disaster.
Yeah, or the other, I mean, to me, part and parcel of what John is saying, though, is you will, if hitters don't change their swing. And so it may take some time and strikeouts will skyrocket. The question is how do we motivate hitters to adjust? And you have to me, there have to be several changes done in tandem with this. I mean, maybe if hitters have to cover more of the strike zone, you do have to either lower the mound or move it back a foot or some such thing. There have to be several things done together. If you do these isolated, you're going to have unintended consequences.
Moving it forward or back seems like a much more extreme step. I don't think that's a controversial opinion, but a much more extreme step than simply raising or lowering, if for no other reason than it's a consistent distance from, like you said, starting at age 13 up. So this is what pitchers have been throwing from basically their entire lives. And to have them suddenly experience something different only in the major leagues or only in the professional leagues would be a huge, huge change. Also, unintended consequences, you're going to get more movement, like more absolute movement with more distance for the ball to travel. So that'll be a change as well.
I mean, I honestly can see no downside to lowering the mound by 1 inch everywhere in professional baseball today. And we'll see where we're at after a year of that.
Mark, you can give us some historic perspective. I know just in my lifetime, the strike zone has been changed, I think, 3 different times. I mean, it was at one time top of the shoulders.
It's 4 times for Mark.
And then they changed it from to the bottom of the knee, to the cup of the knee, to the top of the knee. They changed it down from the shoulder to the armpit, and then to the halfway point between the shoulder and the belt.
Yeah, the most recent change they made was really funny because there was a view in the 90s that the strike zone had become too small. So what they did is they took the strike zone that was in the rule book, which was not being called. People were calling essentially a microwave oven size strike zone, which is what people were claiming was the reason why, Mark McGwire and people like that could sort of hone their swing, because the strike zone, they had lost all the strike zone. They actually took the rule book strike zone and made it smaller top and bottom, but in such a way that they made the umpires now call that strike zone, which actually was larger than the strike zone they were calling. So it was this weird thing where they said, you need to call more strikes, but we won't make you call the strikes as much as the rule book says, because the rule book strike zone was basically gone. Nobody was paying attention to that. I think that the thing that made the strike zone more consistent, and I agree with Rob that I think that umpires are better today than they've ever been, and I think it's because of the technology that we now have, and the umpires can actually look at themselves on video, and presumably their supervisor can say, here are the pitches you missed, and you need to go work on this with this simulator. And I suspect that the incredible, famous people of our youth like Doug Harvey was missing more strikes than the typical guy today, because I think we just know a lot more. But yeah, I think that the strike zone would probably be less of a impact to the game, maybe to sort of the romance of the game, because it's been changed so much, than the distance. However, I think that I'm probably more pro move the mound back than other people in this call, but I don't know. I think that's one of the reasons why you have to experiment with all this stuff. In now that Major League Baseball owns every league, they certainly have the ability to experiment.
Yeah, I think I'm with you on moving the mound back too. It is, from a historical perspective, a little more sacrosanct than changing the height, but pitchers are so much bigger and stronger today. I mean, there is a difference, and I want to give some advantage to the Greg Maddoxes and Marco Gonzalez's and Whitey Fords who don't throw as hard but hit their corners and do it with guile and command and movement on the baseball. I think we are at the end of the day a skill sport, not just a power sport, and things to me, and this is my bias, that emphasize skill over power are good.
This would be an extreme change in the opposite direction, and one that I'm definitely not advocating for. But one of my favorite baseball writers is Sam Miller, most recently of ESPN, currently not writing anywhere. And his proposal for the strike zone was to just call a ball that the batter can hit. Not location based at all, just in the umpire's judgment. If it's a fair pitch that the batter could hit, it's a strike.
That was quite literally the reason that strikes were invented back in the 1870s. I mean, the idea that if you played as a kid, we didn't call balls and strikes. The pitcher would just throw the ball, and then people would yell at you if you didn't swing, right? And the purpose of calling balls and strikes way back when was just to make sure that you threw a ball that the guy could hit.
Yeah. Well, and
the whole point of it.
It could almost bring in an interesting dimension of the umpire deciding, no, that pitch is too fast. He couldn't have hit that, so it's a ball.
Yeah, and in the very early days, the point of the pitcher was not to strike the guy out. It was his job was to serve up a pitch that could be hit. I have a humorous anecdote to add. I don't know if I'm hoping that Allison Levin is still on the call, but in the 1960s, Joe Cronin was the president of the American League, and I did a lot of research on him. I wrote a book about him a number of years ago. And the issue of time of game was kind of an issue then. It always kind of is. The times they were talking about were just so much shorter than we're talking about now. And the big rule change that they made in I think it was in either 1967 or 1968, was to require that every team had a bullpen cart. So, that was outside the box. And if you grew up when I did, everybody had a bullpen cart.
Right.
And then they tried to bring them back a couple years ago, and none of the pitchers would use them. This guy's got to.
Yeah, they became available and not popular just a year or two back. Yeah.
No, but I think pre the original bullpen carts, apparently there were relievers that were just walking in really slow, and they thought this was a big deal. So like in Yankee Stadium, the bullpens were so far away that it would take several minutes to come in. So they put the bullpen carts in for that reason.
I'm going to jump in to answer a question from the chat, if that's all right with everyone, because I see that Pete has asked, how can robots consistently identify the top and bottom of the strike zone? To my understanding, from MLB, is that there are going to be measurements taken either in advance of the season or a couple times in season, or maybe even in advance of every game, that will they're determine the height regardless of your stance of where the zone would be called. And I think they're going to, I believe there's still plans in place to start implementing this at some of the lower levels of the minors this year, assuming that the minors happen.
I know baseball had talked a couple of years ago about, I mean, they've done some of their experimentation in the Atlantic League, which is an independent league on the East Coast. And they were trying to actually get them to move the mound back and try to see what it would be like. And I don't remember if it was 6 inches or a foot or a foot and a half, but somewhere in that range. And I tried to track down to see what the impact of that was. And apparently it never got done. Because the Atlantic League fields are used for multiple purposes, including rec baseball and high school baseball and other community uses, and so they couldn't just change their mound for one purpose and not the others. So it apparently never got done. But I would like to see it, and I'd be glad to see baseball experimenting with that in all of these things, frankly, at lower minor league levels to see what happens.
Well, as it
let's
stands right.
Move off. I
Oh,
want
go
to
ahead.
before we run out of time, I want to make sure we cover the base runners, because some of the talk is let's get more base stealing, and one of the ways of bringing small ball back is to get base runners more involved in the game and get a little more excitement that way. And a couple of the things talked about, one is changing the pickoff rules to change the way pitchers step to first base, or even require them to step off before throwing over, which would be a very dramatic change. The second thing talked about, which I think was actually pretty close to being implemented, but I think it's not being implemented this year, is enlarging the bases. So if you make the bases a little bit bigger in their dimensions, you've put the runner a few inches closer. You're essentially shortening without changing the 90-foot base path. For other standpoints, you're actually giving a few inches advantage to the runner, because catchers have obviously gotten much better. They all have recorded pop times and everything else these days. So
and more than that, we're starting to be able to track throws from the catchers like we can pitches, even with the StatCast system in place. So I think that's going to go even further.
Say that again, John.
Just to your point about catcher, like tracking catcher data, pop times, that sort of thing. With the new StatCast system in place in Hawkeye, we're going to start to be able to get measurements on catcher throws in the same way we get measurements on pitcher throws. And I think that's only going to go further towards that.
Velocity, scale. Movement, how much their throws are drifting and so forth.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. Interesting. I want to see what people thought of that. I like the idea of getting base runners more involved in the game again, especially, again, consistent with my thought of kind of changing this from just a power game to getting back to a speed and skill game.
I mean, I think it obviously falls under the heading of more exciting baseball, no question. More triples, more stolen bases. These are obviously good things. I have always tended to think about getting more base running as a natural outgrowth of less power, as opposed to trying to force the issue by making larger bases or changing what the pitchers can do. I'm not saying my thinking was correct. I just always thought that if I can achieve this bigger thing of having more balls in play, that's going to naturally lead to this other thing, more fast, more exciting base running. But maybe that's not the right approach.
Yeah,
coming at it from,
we need them in conjunction with each other.
Yeah, so coming at it from the perspective of someone working in the analytics department for a professional baseball team, we pay extremely close attention to the break-even sort of ratio, the break-even level of success of stolen base success rate. And so I honestly think that any little changes there, including making the base 3 inches bigger or whatever it's going to be, would have a pretty dramatic effect on how often our guys are attempting stolen bases. Though I would also want the Major League Rulebook to accurately place the bases, because this is something I found in some of my recent work, is that the field as defined in the rulebook can't physically exist. Like the angles and measurements don't match up accurately, which has always bothered me then.
It bothered Maury Wills too, I think.
But yeah, I think Rob, that your point about like having that come as a natural outcome of changing the amount of power in the game is true, and that's one way to achieve it. But I do think it's achievable in other ways as well.
John, what is considered break even for base stealing?
Well, we actually go pretty in depth in terms of measuring the catcher, measuring the pitcher, their time to home, measuring runner speed. So I can't say that it's the same for any given circumstance. Like I need to know I need to know runner, catcher, pitcher, park to be able to tell you a break even level.
Got it. But I mean, but in terms generally, I would assume you'd want to see something 75. Like 70%,
yeah,
or 75% success rate.
Yeah, generally it falls in the 70 to 80 range.
Remember when Bill James started writing, and he would talk about the break even. That was the first time I really thought about it when I was a young adult. And at the time, it was like 67%. He figured like 2/3 was break even, and that was because the game was different. I mean, the run environment was different. And once the run environment changed, which it did, after in the years after Bill James, by the 90s, the run environment became 5 runs a game instead of 4 runs a game, and suddenly 2/3 was bad, and now you need 75%, and 75% is tough. That's
John, do you know if the increase in average pitch velocity has a significant impact on stolen base success rate?
I don't have numbers to give you, but I would say so. Yes.
Is there any correlation between guys who throw harder and being naturally slower to the plate?
That's a good question that I don't have an answer to off the top of my head. It wouldn't surprise me per se. I mean,
I'm just thinking.
I wish I had. I wish I could say definitively.
Closers are notoriously bad at holding runners on, and I always figured it's because they're just out there absolutely max effort, putting everything they can into their delivery, and therefore slowing it down just a bit.
We may have some background guests on my feed here.
We like it. The notion of changing the pickoff rule, I guess, as a pitcher troubles me, and I'd be really reluctant to lose the Andy Pettitte pickoff move if they said that Andy Pettitte couldn't go over to first without stepping off the rubber first. There are certain pitchers who really are artists at this, and again, it is one of those art forms within the game. Whitey Ford was one when I was growing up as a kid watching him. I saw a game where he picked a guy off first, second, and third in the same game. You get some who are really, really good at it. But I can understand trying to find ways to motivate more base running. I'd like to see them do it other than changing the pickoff rule. I would. The one thing that they don't call that is technically illegal is the jump spin move on a right-handed pitcher, but they rarely call it because it's very, very difficult to spot, unless you're doing it with replay.
Something else I think they could change, and I'm taking this from Pete in the chat, but I agree with it, is changing the rules around replay on some of these events, and maybe redefining an out so that if a runner sliding into second comes off the bag for an imperceptible fraction of a second, that maybe that doesn't need to be an out.
That's right. I agree. Boy, I agree with that, because we find that most runners do come off at some point in that slide. I
think replay is great for correcting a call that is obviously incorrect, that the umpire has just missed, which they don't miss many, but they do sometimes. But to use it to find these tiny margins of outs that weren't outs before we had this incredible slow motion video, I don't necessarily think from a personal point of view that that's the way that it should be used, or that even the league should allow it to be used.
Right.
So John, I've always I don't disagree. Well, on a sort of a philosophical level, I disagree with that idea, but on a practical level, I agree with it. What I've always wondered is what would the standard be? But I never thought you could probably just timestamp it, right?
Yeah, I would almost think that don't allow the replay umpire, and I agree with whether it was Bart or Mark saying there should just be a fifth umpire on the crew. Don't let them use a slow motion replay. Let them use whatever angle they want, but don't let them use a slow motion replay. Have them watch it in real time from whatever angle they choose to watch it. And if
Right.
they can tell that the incorrect call was made, then that should be changed, but otherwise not. If you don't mind, just to touch on something else for a second, Dixie sent me a private message about the field being incorrect. If you look at all of the specified measurements in terms of angles and distances between things on the baseball field, they can't all exist. The distance is not correctly specified between home and second, or not everything is a 90-degree angle. Not everything is a right angle. It's one of the two, and it has to be. And if you go out on a major league field, like I've done in spring training, with a protractor and a long tape measure, you'll find that it doesn't match up exactly because it physically can't.
Bad geometry. Bob, anything coming in you want to direct to us?
Well, John's been, I didn't, I'm reluctant to say a little more because you guys are doing such a good job. John's been reading a few of the best things anyway, what Pete said about coming off the bag and stuff like that. A lot of comments. People are recommending Peter Morris's book, A Game of Inches, to fill in a lot of the things of what we're talking about. And that's certainly true. Talk about pitch class. Not a lot of, mostly comments here. See if I have a question here. What's the best book that explores the challenges to pitchers starting in 1893 when the mound was moved back? That's from Steve Steinberg.
I think Peter Morris's book is probably the answer. I mean, you have to move around. I mean, there was certainly if you know to read the right entries. By the way, it's a 2-volume set. It's called The Game of Inches. There's 2 pretty thick books, and if you go to the correct entries, you can get a pretty good evolution about how pitchers were learning new pitches and new grips and new substances, especially until it all became illegal.
Matthew's got a couple of them on his video feed there, Matthew Kramer.
Yeah, there's one question from him. It asks, how far down the developmental level would you need the robot umpire for hitters to adjust? It may not be cost effective for the lower levels and would put hitters at a disadvantage once they get to upper levels.
I'll jump in on that if that's all right, just because I think MLB is going along with their purchase of all the minor leagues. I think they are moving towards getting a StatCast-like system, if not the full 12 camera setup, then at least something that can accomplish the same thing, installed all the way from the Florida State League on up. I don't think it's happening immediately, and I think teams will probably be asked to bear some of the cost of that, though that's so far outside of my realm of expertise that I can't say that for sure. But given that they are trying to start this in both Florida and Arizona, I think that it's going to exist throughout the minors at some point in the next, say, 10 years.
Okay.
Well, I'm mindful that we are 10 minutes over our time. I'm happy to stay on and answer questions or be part of any further conversation. But John, or Bob, I wanted to turn it back to you at this point to see if there are things you wanted to still accomplish with the things coming in.
There's been a lot of comments here, so it's been hard to keep up here. Let's see here.
So I just wanted to chime in and say that I've kind of I have another thing I need to go to. So I wanted to thank Bart and Bob especially for having me on, and obviously to Rob and John too. It was great. And you guys don't have to care about me, but I need to go.
Thank you, Mark. We really
Thank you,
appreciate
Mark.
your participating.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah.
It was a lot of fun.
I think maybe we could just, if no one else has anything, maybe we should, we've run over here, and I think maybe we've come to a stopping point. Bart,
I
you have anything?
assumed I'd bring it down, but I didn't.
Without you, it's, you know.
Boy, if Alan is still on the call, I had a question to ask him, but I feel like he may have just disappeared. Ah, too late. I should have asked when he was talking before. Oh well.
He's a great resource.
Well, he brought up the work of Bart Smith and seam shifted wake, which is just, it's a fascinating new topic. It's the first new sort of pitch tracking topic that's really been exciting in a long time. And I just love to hear his take on it. Sort of the effects of the position of the seams oriented in space, and how air is coming off the back of the ball having effect on the movement beyond just the Magnus force of the spin. It's anyway, I should really, it's technically a work day for me. I should probably hop off the call as well.
Well, I can say from having pitched in senior leagues for 25 years now, where we use a raised seam ball. And so it is a significantly different seam than Major League ball. And boy, you really do see a difference. I mean, the ball we use is very similar to what they use in college baseball. The trajectory of the ball is quite different. I mean, they don't carry as far. It takes a little bit of velocity off for the pitchers, but you get a little better grip and movement and spin. Anyway, I won't say movement because we don't, you know, that's more subjective. But we
movement given spin, movement given spin. So yeah, thanks for having me on. This was great. Anytime you want me to come back, happy to. So
okay.
All right,
John.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Talk to you later, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, Bob, anything else?
No, we did have a comment from somebody that said if we had smaller mitts, that would help too. You know, make everyone wear the second baseman's mitt all the time there. I thought that was interesting.
Well, there's no question. No question. You know, if you go back, I've been watching in my time of sitting home through the pandemic, watching a lot of the old baseball video that you can find on YouTube or occasionally on the MLB network. And there were a lot more errors, even back to the 40s, 50s, 60s. Fields were a little bit more inconsistent in their quality. Gloves were smaller, and there was a lot more subjectivity. And I think one of the things I think we love about baseball is there's a randomness to the game of baseball. You can hit the ball right on the screws and you hit into a double play, and you can bloop one and it drops in. But that randomness is also reflected on, you know, whether or not the fielder actually fields the ball, gets to the ball, gets it off, bounces off his glove, hits a pebble, those types of things. So we have perfected this game so much that we've lost some of that intrigue.
Well, it's certainly nice to see everyone, and I hope someday soon we'll be going out for a beer after this meeting here. But for now we'll be drinking in private, I guess.
Okay. Well, thank you, Bob, for helping organize this.
Oh, Bart, Bart deserves the credit for this. You guys a lot. He deserves 95% of the credit. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. We're going to end it here. Okay.
All right.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
So long,
Talk soon.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Okay.